outlines up here if anyone needs one. Got a few extras. Hey there. I got one more if anyone needs it. That's not our full study, but that will get us through tonight. We are in Romans chapter 1. We're going to continue there this evening and pick up about where we left off. We were on page 5, and so let's pick up right there. Page 5, we were looking at verses 1 through 7 of Romans chapter 1. And we ended last week really on number 7, how is one called to God? And let's just summarize briefly, and then we'll pick up there on number 8. We discussed how folks in religious settings or even in our daily culture and media outlets will claim that they've been called to do certain things. They've been called to go, do this job or do this task. They've been called to marry this person or marry that person. Sometimes folks will even take it to the point where they're called to do something that's unscriptural. But really it's just a saying, and we discussed this a little last week, where really it's become detached from the Scriptures and the reality and realities within the Scriptures, this idea of being called. So let's just remind ourselves of a few verses here. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and if someone could read for me there verse 14. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 14.
Whereunto he called you by our gospel to the obtaining of the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, so how has God called the Thessalonian brethren in this instance? What is being written here by the Apostle Paul as he's inspired of God to write it? They were called by the gospel. Well, how was the gospel given unto them? Let's go over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And if someone can read for me here, verse 13. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 13.
For this cause also thank we God without ceasing, because when we received the word of God, which ye heard of us, ye received it, not as the word of men, but as it is in truth the word of God, which effectively worketh also in you that believe.
So where did this word come from? Where did that which was preached unto them, the gospel, where ultimately did it come from? Did it come from Paul? Was he just giving them some ideas? No, it ultimately came from God. And Paul will remind us of this throughout his letters. Take, for example, if you go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and if someone could read for me here, verses 11 through 16. 1 Corinthians 2, 11 through 16.
For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ.
All right, thank you very much. So we studied this before together. I can't know what you're thinking right now. You can't know what I'm thinking right now. The idea of being able to know one another's thoughts is impossible. It can't happen unless we were to have one another's spirit. That is, unless your mind was literally to be given or shared with me. And what Paul is explaining here is we as apostles have been given the mind of Christ. The Corinthian brethren needed to be reminded of this given the context of these first few chapters, and we've studied that together as well. He's emphasizing ultimately the authority and the source by which he is commanding them and instructing them, and has done so already. And so, just like with the Thessalonians, just like with the Corinthians, just like throughout the New Testament scriptures, we see that those who were called by the gospel were done so via preaching, and that preaching and the message that was taught ultimately derived and came from God. For example, and we've studied this as well, John chapter 16 and verse 13, Jesus tells them there that they're going to be guided into all truth. They would be given all truth. And so therefore, as they were teaching, as they were preaching, they were not lacking truth, but all truth was available so that those who were hearing could know what they needed to do in order to be right with God. And now today, we have that available to us in its written form, as that truth has indeed been delivered, as Jude describes for us in Jude verse 3. So any other comments there on verse 7? How is one called to God? Nothing else? All right, let's go on to verse 8. Who are the called out? What is their task? Who are the called out, and what is their task? The church is the called out, right? It's literally the meaning of the Greek word, ekklesia, the called out. The church are those who are called out. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 6, and if someone could read for me here, verses 17 and 18.
Therefore go out from their midst, and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty.
The next question there, what is their task? I mean, this passage in a way tells us what it is in a sense, to a degree. We are, in being called out, to be separated to and for God, to not be touching the unclean thing, to be received of God. And we are to be children of God in having made the decision to obey the gospel via baptism. Note Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27, that we become children of God through being baptized. And so, what is our task? Well, part of our task is remaining pure. Part of our task is remaining separated for the service of God. Now, what does the denominational world, what does even some of our very own brethren tell us in that regard? This idea of being separated in regards to behavior and lifestyle, etc. What are we told and tempted with based upon ideas all the time?
To conform, be part of the crowd.
To be, you say accepting? To be accepting, to be conformed, to be a part of the crowd, to blend in, right, with the world, that is, to give the impression that we are right in step with them, because we certainly don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. Our focus should not be how the world perceives us. Our focus should be on how God perceives us. And God right here is telling us in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, that He wants us to be sanctified. He wants us to be cleansed. He wants us to be separated for His service so that we can serve Him. Now, that does not mean separated in the sense that we are to become monks and to be completely void from any human interaction. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 9, and if someone could read for me here, verses 19 through 21. 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 21.
Although I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I become as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law.
So what is Paul's intention for mingling, associating, conversing, hanging out, being around folks of the world? Converting them. That is his intention. is his intention, even in the process of converting them, to make them have the impression that he is lockstep with them in their behavior and lifestyle? No. Because he tells us very plainly at the end of that passage there in verse 21 that he's not going to do this by living in such a way that he is now discounting or leaving the law of Christ. So therefore, what ultimately is he doing as he associates with them? If he's not in lockstep in regards to their behavior and lifestyle, what is he striving to do?
Verse 22 sums it up.
Okay, verse 22 there.
To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. So he knows he's not going to get them all.
Okay, so he's not going to get them all. But if we were to stop right here just in verse 22 and not consider verse 21, it might sound like he's trying to live in lockstep with their behavior, because he's going to become as them. What does he mean, become as them?
Well, he's going to interact. He can blend in.
Okay.
He can see both sides and get it.
Okay. Blend in not necessarily in behavior, but blend in maybe in another way, right?
Blend in a human way.
Sure.
He can be maybe sympathetic with them.
Okay.
Or empathize, I guess that would be a better one.
Sure.
But then, of course, explain it, because like it's 22, he says that by all means I might save some. So he knows that he's got a huge task.
Sure. Sure. And he also knows, to your point, it's not going to be victorious from man's perspective in that he would save all of them. Have you ever been up northeast before? Or somewhat northeast, mid-north, northeast area? They don't say y'all. You know what they say? Ewins. So if you're going to spend some time up there for quite a while, what might you begin to do over time? You might begin to talk like that. You might start saying Ewins. Y'all might kind of be carved out of your vocabulary. And if someone from up north were to come down here, how might they begin to talk after a while? The right way. Like a southern, right? Yeah. I actually was born in Maine, but I've been told that I have a southern accent to a sense. I don't even know. But over time, generally, Amy's, I think, a great example. My guess is Brother Hank and Sister Diane would tell us that Amy probably was not born speaking with somewhat of a British accent. But she spent so much time over there that if you listen to her talk, you think that she would probably have been born or raised in that area. What has she done? She's just kind of picked up and adapted to that culture and that surrounding. So what Paul is saying is, to an extent far beyond just words and accents, etc., but not to the extent of disobeying the law of God, he's seeking to try to find common ground so that he might be able to win others to the gospel. The task of being the called out, it's really a two-part task. Have you ever played the game Spades before? You can either go null, where you try not to get any, or you can try to shoot for the moon, get all you can. But if you're trying to find a balance, you're trying to figure out how you're going to play, basically. Well, as a Christian, a lot of times we need to figure out how we're going to play. There are certain situations and settings where we don't need to get involved. We don't need to be around. We don't need to maybe even interact, depending upon who we are and what the situation is. And we have to make that decision. We have to figure out what that is. And it's going to probably vary. But there are other situations where, not to the compromising of God's law, we need to figure out how we can be a salt, or be a light to those around us. So being the called out, it is a challenge. As a matter of fact, Jesus tells us that's the way heaven is. Matthew chapter 7, 13 through 14. It's hard. It's not easy. If it was easy, every single person in the world would be a Christian. It's not easy. It's hard. Any other comments on number 8 here?
In 1 John there, I was just reading it, it says, 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, believe not every spirit, but test the spirit to see if they're God. So test those people you're talking to see if they got biblical sayings or not.
Right. Right.
We've got to know what they believe
Right.
in order to teach them.
Right. That, well, yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. I never thought about it that way, but yes, whether or not what they are saying is of God, and at the same time, if they are making comments or making some statements that are in line with scriptures, we should hone in on that. We should seek to emphasize
Find
that.
some common ground, really.
Yeah, that's the area really where we want to play. And if we're able to get to that field, if you will, from a study perspective or an interaction perspective, that's kind of where we want to park if we're able to. But to your point as well, we also have to be very aware and knowledgeable that they might say things, and as we're studying with folks, they might say this or that or the other, and we have to ultimately go to the Word of God to know whether or not they are accurate in their beliefs and understanding. Any other comments there on 8 before we move on to 9? All right, let's move on to question 9 here. Discuss Paul's life, mission, and message. Does yours measure up to his? Well, I think this could take the rest of the year there. We could study this for a long time. Let's start with the end part there of 9. Does ours measure up to his? Because probably most folks in here are aware to a degree of the servitude of Paul. We just read some of it there just a few minutes ago in 1 Corinthians 9. We get an idea as to how much he's willing to sacrifice and give of himself. He said he's made himself a servant unto all men. Do we measure up to that? I think we can all answer that internally, but let's ask ourselves this question, because this is the bigger question that we need to answer. Are we striving to live up to that? I would imagine if we separated the room tonight of who did not live up to what Paul did in his life, they would be over here, and who did, they would be over here. Probably every one of us would probably be over here. But here's the real question. How many of us would be in the camp of I'm striving and continuously thinking as to how I can better apply my life and myself in order to glorify God, similar to the ways that Paul did? That's something that we can certainly always seek to align ourselves with. Let's discuss his life, his mission, and his message. Any thoughts on that? Without taking the rest of the year.
Well, his message was crossing Jesus and the crucifixion.
Absolutely. That was his focus.
That was his message.
Absolutely. And you're referring right there to 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 2. I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That was his message. His message was, you need to hear the gospel. You need to know what Jesus requires. You need to know the commandments of God. Absolutely. What was his mission?
Spread the gospel to all of the non-Jews.
Okay. In a very specific sense, absolutely. That he was given those direct commands. Acts chapter 26 in verse 17, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, unto whom now I send thee, to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me. And that doesn't mean he didn't preach to the Jews. Matter of fact, he would start off preaching to the Jews usually. But they were usually unwilling or rejected him, and he would say, you have judged yourselves unworthy of everlasting life. Acts chapter 13 and verse 46. So he says in verse 47 of Acts 13, for so hath the Lord commanded us, saying, I have sent thee to be a light to the Gentiles, that thou shouldest be for salvation unto the ends of the earth. And when the Gentiles heard this, they were glad and glorified the word of the Lord. And as many as were ordained to eternal life believed, and the word of the Lord was published throughout all the region. So Paul makes it very, very plain there to the Jews that he had just preached to, verses 44 and 45. You're rejecting the gospel. You don't want anything to do with it. Fine. I'm going on to the Gentiles, the folks who will hear it and receive it gladly. Let me ask you this. Could we draw some general lines of groups of folks who would be less receptive to hearing the gospel and obeying it, and who would be more receptive to hearing the gospel and obeying it. Generally, speaking generalities.
Those not indeed, those indeed.
Okay, physically speaking. Okay, absolutely. So maybe more affluent areas, generally speaking, not always. Maybe they're less willing. Why are they less willing?
They don't need anything.
From their perspective, I have my iPhone, my Suburban, my house, my boat, my whatever, and I'm so blinded and infatuated with these physical possessions that I don't need God. Everything seems hunky-dory to me because physically I'm just fine. Absolutely. That seems to be the case. Are there any other lines or ways we could segment groups, applying kind of what Paul was dealing with back then to us today?
I think the religious background of people has a lot to do with that.
Sure.
You know, Paul said, you know, you're not gonna listen to me, I'm gonna go over here to somebody that will.
Right.
The Jews were very set in their religious,
Right.
in their belief in what was what, and they didn't wanna hear anything new.
Sure.
But the Gentiles wouldn't, so you got that same problem today, you've got people that are in the world that are members in some religious organization, and they're happy with that. They don't,
Right.
they don't need to be listening to the
Right.
gospel. And the people's out here that's lost, they know they're lost, and they're hoping for something. I think they'd be more willing than someone that's set in their religious belief.
Absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely. From a denominational perspective or even just a religious perspective in general, the more serious and committed and devoted and sincere folks are, it's not that, again, we shouldn't waste our time, because Paul clearly is doing that here. It's just that we probably should expect a similar reaction to that which Paul got from the Jews. And there are other classes or groups of folks who are less religiously knowledgeable and convicted. Now, let's take that another step further. What demographic of people, again, generalities, in this country would fit the more set in our ways, I know Bible facts, I have a denominational conviction, I'm not moving, I'm here, versus another demographic who maybe is, what's the Bible? I mean, I know what it is, but I've never really actually been taught it. Could we draw some general lines?
Baptist versus Catholic?
Baptist versus Catholic? Yeah, absolutely. Generally, right? We're just speaking in general terms here. A devoted Baptist, which Baptists you could say in some cases in some societies and areas maybe tend to be a little bit more devoted more commonly than such as Catholics, who would maybe be, you know what, I'm going to go in April to Mass, and I'm going to go in December to Mass, and that's all I'm really going to do, and I've not really questioned or know why I'm doing what I'm doing. Sure, that's a great example. Any other ways to segment this?
Well, the community churches, it don't matter what you believe, just whatever you believe is fine.
Okay,
Your own religion.
okay,
Basically.
sure.
That will accept anything.
Sure. So there may be a lack of foundation, a lack of root, a lack of doctrinal understanding, and there may be a hunger for that, potentially. We don't know. I remember a family that Hannah and I know, and they were both raised in the Baptist denomination. It's interesting, because this doesn't exactly align. That's why we're talking generalities. But I think it was more community-like based, which a lot of Baptist congregations are tending to lean that way nowadays. Not all of them, but some. But they would say, and if you met with them now and talked to them, we never learned or even heard the word doctrine. Now, I understand that's not necessarily the case in every congregation. There would probably be some who would stand up and oppose that and say, well, that's not the way it works necessarily at all Baptist churches, and maybe that's the case, but usually in a community church-like setting or that type of environment, it is. It's very happy-go-lucky. It's very feel-good and entertainment-based. The focus is not necessarily on God's teaching and instruction and what He wants us and requires us to do in order to be right with Him and sanctified, as we looked at just a few moments ago in 2 Corinthians 6, 17, and 18, but more come here to enjoy a social environment and good friendships. That's really the goal. So yeah, that's one too. I think there's several others, and I think really contemplating this could help us in our evangelism efforts. I would say we could break it up in age groups. Where would the older age group generally probably fall in regards to a religious conviction compared to a, millennial or Generation Z or whatever the other one is now that's younger than millennials? Where would they fall? Where would the comparisons probably lie? I can tell you right now, my 60s parents and most 60s parents weren't really set on teaching their children the Bible. And in a lot of ways had an anger against the Bible, opposed a religious structured environment in the home. Again, it's general terms. So millennial folks and younger folks, hey, you know what? It might be getting closer and closer to where some of these doors that we've been hitting and some of these folks and contacts we've been making, rather than getting it slammed in on our face, they might actually start saying, sure, I'll come study. Why not? Because from their perspective, they've never really learned or associated much anyway. Versus the older generation may not be the case. They may not be the case. And again, that's just general terms. I think there's other ways we can do it as well. Areas throughout the world, which we've kind of already alluded to a sense. This country, Europe, Canada, other certain places throughout the world probably are not very ripe for sowing the seed. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt. But there's other places in the world that probably are, who probably fit all the descriptions of those who would maybe be more willing, likened unto the Gentiles here in Acts 13, to hear the gospel. Poorer financially and economically, less committed and convicted in a religious system of belief. If there is a system of belief, it is very ritualistic. If there is folks or are folks who are set in their ways, they're probably older and maybe even dying off in that region. And I think there are some regions we could identify, and I think we could figure out as a congregation how we can aid in the spreading of the gospel in those regions. So those are some things to think about. Any other comments or thoughts? What about Paul's life? Any verses or scriptures come to mind? Yes, ma'am.
I think that part of the reason why Paul was not successful with the Jews was part of the same reason why Christ was not successful with the Jews. Paul was very zealous as Saul, persecuting the Christians. And he was a large figure in the hierarchy of the Jews.
Sure.
And they saw him in this role, and then he makes a turnaround
Sure.
and starts preaching back to them.
Right.
And they're thinking, we know who he is. He was
Sure.
just holding the coats for them to stone Stephen.
Sure.
It's, so they had doubts about him.
Sure.
Because they knew who he was. But when he went to the Gentiles didn't have that
Sure.
reference to bring back, like the Jews with Christ. He said, well, we know who he is. He's the son of a carpenter.
Right. That's a good point.
Who
Right.
is he to say he's the son of God?
Sure. That, and then also the attitude probably in general of who are you preaching to us kind of thing, even if they didn't know him, right? Because probably in maybe some of these regions, surely in some of these regions, the Jews in that region, the synagogue of that area probably didn't know Paul. But certainly in Judea, in the region where he dwelt, that certainly probably was something that was thought of. But in general, the Jewish folks were probably very much like they were when Christ was on earth in his ministry, with the attitude and the mindset of, who are you to preach to me? You're offending me. How dare you tell me that I'm in the wrong? Don't you know that I'm a Jewish leader? Don't you know who I am? And, even the apostles recognized this. Even the apostles were aware that Jesus was offending these Jewish leaders. They said to Jesus at one time in Matthew 15 and verse 12, knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended after they heard this saying? You're offending them. They're wanting to know, who are you to tell us how we ought to live. And Jesus responded and said, "Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch." Jesus wasn't concerned with the fact that they were offended. But yes, excellent comment. Any thoughts about Paul's life?
One thing that comes to mind is the Jewish leaders were afraid of losing power.
Right.
Some of the common Jews accepted Christ.
Yes.
That's how Paul was able to convert them, even on the day of Pentecost. Most of those who converted were Jews.
Right.
But the leaders were afraid of Jesus because they were afraid to lose power.
They did not want to lose their religious, economic ecosystem. And hence, one of the reasons Stephen was stoned. Notice what Stephen says. Let's go to Acts 7. In Acts 7, Stephen says the following. Look with me here in verse 40. Saying unto Aaron, "Make us gods to go before us. For this Moses, which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, and offered sacrifice unto the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned, and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets, O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Molech, and the star of your god, little g god, Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness, as he had appointed, speaking unto Moses, that he should make it according to the fashion that he had seen, which also our fathers that came after brought in with Jesus," as Joshua, "into the possession of the Gentiles, whom God drave out before the face of our fathers unto the days of David, who found favor before God and desired to find a tabernacle for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him an house. Howbeit, the Most High dwelleth not in the temples made with hands, not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet, Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things?" And so he then will go on and rebuke them even further, reminding them of what they just did by crucifying Jesus, and ultimately making it plain that Jesus is standing on the right hand of God. Verse 55. What ultimately are they realizing here when Stephen is preaching this to them? What did they worship? What did they put a lot of stock in?
Temple worship, Moses, the law of Moses.
Yes, it was the temple itself. It was, rather than worshiping the God who was allowing them to have this temple, they were literally worshiping the temple. They were literally worshiping Moses. They were literally focused on the physical things that were surrounding them, and not rather God and His glory. And so they had failed, and this was a wake-up call to them, and so therefore ultimately they ended up stoning Stephen. So yes, even, there's other things that you could think about here as well. What else had gotten to the point of being worshipped? It wasn't just the temple, and it wasn't just the law of Moses. Who else? Think about who had power.
The priest.
Exactly, the high priest. The high priest. Let's go, and I wasn't going to go here, but we're here, so let's go there. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians. And if someone could read for me here verses 3 through 10.
What chapter?
Chapter 2. Sorry. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 3 through 10.
Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things? And now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doeth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceptiveness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved.
All right, I'm just going to go on to verse 11 and 12. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Point here is, and we're not going to get into, who exactly this is talking about, but we can still take away the same point. The high priest would have been dwelling in the temple after he was no longer the high priest. Jesus was made the high priest. Jesus was made the high priest, and Stephen references the fact that Jesus is standing on the right hand of God. Why does that matter? Let's go over to Zechariah 6. And I know we're almost out of time. We're not going to be able to finish this full piece tonight. But let's go to Zechariah 6. And look with me here in verse 13. Zechariah 6 and verse 13. Even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne. And he shall be a priest upon his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. Jesus, when he ascended into heaven, where did he go? What does the Bible tell us about where he went and what he was doing?
Sat down on the right hand of God.
Sat down at the right hand of God. And so Stephen sees this. After just telling them, you are to worship God. God is not an idol. He can't dwell in a temple made with man's hands. Well, that alone infuriates them, right? Then he comments on what he sees, and Zechariah 6 and verse 13 stated very plainly what was going to occur regarding the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be the priest, the high priest. And of course, the Hebrews writer lays that out for us in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13 regarding Jesus. Excuse me, not verse 13. Verse 15. For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So Jesus Christ is now the high priest after, let's just say, AD 33. So who is that person standing in the temple from AD 33 to AD 70? It's not the high priest. What is he trying to retain?
His power.
And in the process of doing so, what is he binding upon people and henceforth making himself what? God. He is telling other folks, you need to do what I say. Trying to still maintain that the law of Moses is in authority. And trying to retain his power. And so, to kind of close that point, George, absolutely regarding the mission of Paul and what he would have been facing and what ultimately he was preaching to regarding preaching to the Jews and why they didn't receive it quickly. and ultimately why that was such an offensive against those who were in power. They were not concerned with the truth of God. They were ultimately concerned with retaining their benefits and the way life was. Thank you all very much for the class. Enjoyed it. Look forward, Lord willing, next week.